They say wealth and fame shield you from the world's cruelties, that money can buy security, happiness, even immortality in the eyes of the public. But that illusion shattered one quiet Sunday morning in Brentwood, California, in a way that no one could have predicted. Behind the towering gates of a $13.5 million estate, a nightmare unfolded that would ripple across Hollywood, across the nation, and into every living room watching the story develop. The people involved were household names, icons in the film world, figures who had laughed, cried, and inspired millions on screen. Yet in real life, they were vulnerable, human, mortal, and tragically, that mortality was brought into horrifying focus on that day. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins with Rob Reiner, a man whose name alone conjures images of cinematic triumph. This is Spinal Tap, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, a man whose career spanned decades, whose presence in Hollywood was larger than life. Beside him was Michelle, his wife, the woman who had been at his side for years, steadfast, loving, seemingly untouchable. They were not just a couple, they were a unit that people envied, a symbol of success and stability in a world that rarely rewards either. But no amount of fame or fortune could protect them from what came next. The morning of discovery was eerily ordinary. Neighbors, accustomed to the quiet rhythm of Brentwood life, noticed nothing amiss at first. The sun rose over manicured lawns, luxury SUVs idled in driveways. The faint scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the California air. But a few hours later, the ordinary would be replaced by shock, confusion, and ultimately horror. A garage door, usually a mundane feature of the estate, became the epicenter of a tragedy that would dominate headlines and haunt everyone involved. The first question on everyone's lips was simple: what could have led to such a horrific scene? The answer, it turned out, was both astonishingly close to home and impossibly shocking. Rob and Michelle were found stabbed to death. Their bodies, lifeless and motionless, bore the cruel marks of violence that no one could have predicted. And standing at the center of suspicion was their own son, Nick, a man of 32 years, who lived in the guest house on the property. The proximity of the suspect to the victims, the very idea that a family member could commit such a heinous act, made the story all the more unsettling. It is tempting, in moments like this, to look for simple explanations. Motives like greed, anger, or mental instability. But human tragedy is rarely simple. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to that day, a tapestry of contradictions, hidden emotions, and buried tensions began to emerge. Questions multiplied like shadows at dusk. Was there resentment simmering beneath the surface? Was there a breaking point no one saw coming? Could fame, wealth, and privilege somehow amplify the darker aspects of human nature rather than shield against them? These questions haunted the detectives, the neighbors, the friends, and ultimately, anyone who tried to make sense of the unfathomable. Imagine for a moment standing at the scene. The garage, an ordinary, utilitarian space designed for storage and shelter for vehicles, was now transformed into a chamber of horror. Investigators spoke of a silence so thick it seemed almost tangible, interrupted only by the faint echoes of their own footsteps and the quiet hum of forensic equipment. And yet, amidst the horror, there was clarity. Patterns emerged. Evidence, meticulous and painstaking, began to tell a story. Not just a story of what happened that morning, but of the lives that had led to it. The successes, the pressures, the hidden struggles of a family that the public thought they knew. The timing of the discovery amplified the shock. A Sunday morning, a time meant for rest, reflection, family, and routine. And instead, the discovery shattered normalcy. For the neighbors, it was a jolt to their sense of safety. For the media, it was a story that demanded immediate attention. For Hollywood, it was a reminder that fame and fortune do not equate to immunity from tragedy. And for the world at large, it became a gripping, almost cinematic story, a story that people could not look away from. But beyond the headlines and the initial shock, there were nuances that painted a far more complex picture. Rob and Michelle were not just victims. They were individuals with histories, relationships, and personalities that shaped their world. To understand the depth of this tragedy, one must step beyond the sensationalism and into the human reality, the family dynamics, the pressures of living under the public gaze, and the tensions that quietly build in even the most seemingly harmonious households. Nick, the son, becomes not just a suspect in a sensational crime, but a central figure in a human drama where love, anger, jealousy, and betrayal intersect in ways that are often invisible to the outside world. And yet, even as we focus on the personal elements, there are elements of the story that remain almost surreal. The estate itself, a symbol of luxury and success, contrasts so sharply with the brutality discovered within. Expensive cars, meticulously maintained landscaping, rooms designed for comfort and display, all of it stands in stark contrast to the violence that took place. It is a visual reminder of the duality of life. Appearances can deceive, and even those who seem to have everything can be consumed by darkness that no amount of money or fame can repel. From a broader perspective, this tragedy also raises uncomfortable questions about society, family, and human behavior. When tragedy strikes within the walls of the rich and famous, the world watches not just for the crime itself, but for insight, explanation, and perhaps cautionary lessons. How does wealth influence behavior, decision-making, and conflict resolution? How does the pressure of public scrutiny exacerbate private tensions? And perhaps most importantly, what does this tell us about the fragility of human relationships, even in families that seem outwardly perfect? Yet for all the speculation, the story is far from complete. There are clues yet to be revealed, pieces of the puzzle that will only emerge as the investigation unfolds, and as we examine the lives, motives, and choices of those involved. The garage, the guest house, the evidence collected by law enforcement, and the confessions or denials of those closest to the tragedy. All of these elements promise revelations that are as shocking as they are emotionally charged. And it is in this interplay between discovery, investigation, and human drama that the true depth of the story comes to light. So, why does this story matter now? Why should anyone outside the confines of Brentwood or Hollywood care about what happened behind those gates? Because it is more than a murder, it is a mirror. It reflects the dark potential within all human relationships. The ways that love and anger, pride and jealousy, secrecy and revelation can collide with devastating consequences. It reminds us that no one, no matter how powerful or seemingly secure, is immune to tragedy. And it challenges us to look not just at the sensational details, but at the emotional and moral questions that follow in the wake of such events. As we prepare to explore this story in detail, it is important to carry with us a sense of both curiosity and caution. Curiosity, because the unfolding events are shocking, layered, and full of twists that defy expectations. Caution, because the truth is often more complex than it appears, and the human costs of misunderstanding or oversimplification are profound. Every interaction, every secret, every emotional crack in the family's facade contributes to a narrative that is simultaneously tragic, compelling, and unforgettable. And just as we think we have begun to understand, just as we imagine we have grasped the shape of the story, there is always more waiting to be revealed. Because what was found in that garage was only the beginning. What was uncovered in the investigation, in the family dynamics, in the layers of secrecy and tension, would change everything, and no one could have anticipated the next twist. By the end of this story, we will have not only traced the events that led to a horrific Sunday morning, but will also have glimpsed into the complexities of human behavior, the fragility of trust, and the way in which tragedy can emerge in the most unexpected places. But before we move into the investigation, the suspect, and the shocking revelations that followed, remember this: the garage door that opened on that day revealed more than just bodies. It revealed a story of love, betrayal, and consequence that reaches far beyond the walls of one estate, one family, or one headline. And yet, even as you absorb these details, even as the horror settles in your mind, the most shocking discoveries are still to come. What the authorities found next, in the course of their meticulous investigation, would defy expectations, challenge assumptions, and change the narrative in ways no one could predict. That discovery would set the stage for a drama that transcends crime reporting, touching on human emotions and conflicts in ways that resonate far beyond the confines of Brentwood. The garage was only the starting point, the first window into a nightmare that would unfold layer by layer. And as we move forward into the heart of this story, one question lingers, heavy and insistent. What secrets are hidden behind the walls of even the most perfect households? What darkness lies beneath the surface of familiar faces? And when tragedy strikes from within, how can anyone prepare for the consequences that follow? Imagine a life that looks flawless from the outside. A sprawling estate in Brentwood, manicured gardens that could grace a magazine cover, luxury cars gleaming in the driveway, and a Hollywood career that seems untouchable. That was the life of Rob and Michelle Reiner. To the public, to their friends, even to casual observers, the couple represented success, stability, and a marriage built to withstand the pressures of fame. But perfection, as it turns out, is often a veneer, and behind the gates of the Reiner estate, cracks had been forming quietly for years. The story of Rob Reiner is well known. As a filmmaker, actor, and cultural figure, his impact on Hollywood is undeniable. From his early days as a young actor on television to directing iconic films that shaped an era, Rob's career was a blend of creativity, risk-taking, and impeccable timing. This is Spinal Tap, forever changed the landscape of comedy. The Princess Bride became a beloved classic, quoted and referenced across generations. When Harry Met Sally redefined romantic comedy with its blend of humor, insight, and heart. On the surface, Rob Reiner had it all. Fame, respect, influence, and the public adoration that so many crave but few truly achieve. Michelle, by contrast, often stayed out of the limelight, choosing instead to focus on family, private endeavors, and a life that complemented Rob's fame rather than competed with it. Those who knew her spoke of a quiet elegance, intelligence, and a capacity for love that was evident in both family and social interactions. Together, they were a couple that seemed to have figured it all out. Neighbors would describe the estate as serene, almost idyllic, a safe haven where Hollywood drama rarely intruded. Yet, the life that seemed untouchable carried with it pressures invisible to outsiders. Fame, after all, is not merely a source of adulation, it's a magnifying glass. Every action, every word, every decision is observed, judged, and discussed. Relationships are scrutinized. Privacy becomes a luxury. And the very success that brings comfort can also isolate, creating gaps between perception and reality. For the Reiners, these pressures were compounded by the presence of their son, Nick, who lived in the guest house on the property. The dynamics of a family living under one roof, yet separated by layers of wealth, expectation, and public attention, can be delicate at best, combustible at worst. Neighbors and acquaintances often commented on the Reiners' generosity, the parties, the charity work, and the glimpses of normalcy they could observe from afar. But inside the walls, the pressures of fame and wealth intertwined with family tensions in ways few could see. Conflict, resentment, and miscommunication are universal human experiences, but when they occur in the shadow of fame, they take on an amplified intensity. Every argument risks public exposure. Every misstep could become fodder for speculation. The veneer of perfection, though reassuring from the outside, hides an intricate web of emotions that can unravel unexpectedly. It's easy to imagine the Reiner estate as a fortress of stability, towering gates, security cameras, and a meticulously maintained driveway. But no amount of physical security can safeguard against the complexities of human behavior. Money may solve logistical problems, but it cannot resolve emotional conflicts, personal grievances, or the silent accumulation of unspoken frustrations. Nick, at 32, lived on the property, physically close to his parents, yet emotionally navigating a complex labyrinth of family expectations, personal ambition, and private struggles. From the outside, Nick's life may have seemed enviable. Access to privilege, a home in a prestigious neighborhood, and the legacy of two accomplished parents. But appearances are deceptive. Family psychologists often note that proximity does not guarantee understanding, and wealth does not prevent resentment. In families where power dynamics are subtle, but tensions simmer, tragedy can emerge from the most unexpected corners. To truly understand what happened in Brentwood, one must examine not only the personalities involved, but also the patterns that exist in households like this. The Reiner family had layers of social expectation, unspoken rules, and carefully maintained public images. Rob was a figure who commanded attention professionally, Michelle the steady partner who maintained equilibrium privately, and Nick the son whose place in the family, though physically defined by his guest house, was emotionally complex. Each role carried pressures, responsibilities, and potential sources of tension. Observers of the tragedy later noted that while the Reiners were admired publicly, few had insight into the daily dynamics of the household. It's a cautionary tale about appearances. Just because a family seems ideal from the outside does not mean it functions smoothly behind closed doors. The concept of the perfect family often masks a reality where communication breaks down, expectations go unmet, and small conflicts accumulate into dangerous consequences. As we explore the events leading up to that horrific Sunday, it becomes clear that the Reiners' public image was meticulously maintained. Every dinner, every gathering, every social engagement projected harmony. But behind the scenes, emotional cracks were forming. Longtime friends later remarked on subtle signs, moments of tension, minor disagreements, unexplained absences, things that, at the time, seemed minor but in hindsight were harbingers of deeper issues. This dichotomy between public perfection and private turbulence is central to understanding the tragedy. It highlights a universal truth. Human relationships, no matter how superficially smooth, are vulnerable. Wealth and fame may amplify risks rather than mitigate them, creating environments where emotional and psychological pressures are intensified rather than alleviated. And so, the stage was set. On one side, a family whose outward life suggested control, success, and stability. On the other, a network of subtle conflicts, emotional strain, and potential resentments that were rarely visible to outsiders. It was a fragile balance, one that could tip under the slightest pressure. Neighbors, friends, and even staff would later recount moments that, in isolation, seemed inconsequential. A raised voice here, a curt response there, a fleeting expression of frustration, all pieces of a puzzle that, when viewed together, revealed an underlying tension. It was invisible to the casual observer, but unmistakable in retrospect. Psychologists and criminologists often highlight that violent family tragedies rarely appear fully formed to outsiders. They're the culmination of small, accumulating factors that explode under pressure. So what happened that Sunday morning? How did a family that seemed perfect from the outside fall victim to unimaginable violence within? The answer begins not in the crime itself, but in understanding the intricate dance of personalities, pressures, and secrets that defined the Reiner household. To grasp the depth of the tragedy, one must first recognize the fragile equilibrium that existed and the ways in which it was disrupted. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Success and wealth do not shield against grief or violence. Public admiration cannot compensate for private unrest. And sometimes, the most horrifying events occur not in distant, unsafe neighborhoods, but in places we assume are secure, protected, and familiar. By now, the picture should be forming: a household of fame, fortune, and outward perfection, but beneath it, the seeds of tension were quietly germinating. Every relationship has its challenges, but in this family, those challenges carried the weight of decades of expectation, privilege, and unspoken emotion. And the very things that seemed like safeguards, the guest house, the wealth, the controlled public image, were ultimately irrelevant in the face of what would unfold. Yet, even with all this context, the tragedy that awaited was impossible to predict. The garage, a mundane space in any other household, became a focal point for horror. The events that took place there would shock the world, shatter perceptions, and leave an indelible mark on everyone connected to the Reiner family. And just when it seems like the story is understood, just when the pieces of perfection and tension appear to balance, the narrative takes a dark turn. What the world would soon discover about that Sunday morning would change everything, casting a shadow over the entire family and leaving the question: how could such a tragedy emerge from within what seemed like a perfect life? The answer, as we will see, lies not only in the events themselves, but in the intricate, hidden dynamics of the Reiner household. And the first step toward understanding begins with a closer look inside the estate. The guest house, the garage, and the spaces that were witness to both love and loss. But even that look would only reveal the beginning. Because what was found inside that garage, what investigators would uncover in the hours and days following the discovery, was far beyond what anyone expected, and it would set the stage for a story of betrayal, horror, and shocking revelation that no one could have imagined. The gates of the Brentwood estate loomed like silent sentinels, guarding a world that, to outsiders, seemed untouchable. From the outside, the mansion was a vision of California luxury. Manicured lawns, sprawling driveways, and an architectural elegance that spoke of careful planning, taste, and wealth. But inside, the story was far more complex, far darker, and far more intimate than anyone outside the neighborhood could imagine. Let's step inside. Imagine walking up the driveway. The air is crisp, almost serene. Birds chirp in the trees. Luxury SUVs gleam in the morning sun. Every detail, the plants, the lighting, the perfectly aligned paths, is designed to give an impression of order, control, and serenity. And yet, as you approach the front doors, there's a subtle tension, almost imperceptible. Perhaps it's in the way the security cameras track movement, or the faint hum of alarms designed to protect against the world outside. In hindsight, these small signs take on an ominous weight. The main house, where Rob and Michelle lived, was a combination of elegance and comfort. Spacious living areas, high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, and an interior designed to impress without ostentation. Every room told a story of taste, culture, and family history. Except, of course, that behind the polished surfaces, tension often lingered. Friends would later remark on the contradictions. A place that seemed inviting yet carried an undercurrent of formality, where warmth existed, but only within carefully constructed bounds. But the main house wasn't the only structure on the property. A guest house, occupied by Nick Reiner, was tucked away to the side. From a distance, it seemed like a secondary space, a private retreat for the adult son, separate from the parents yet close enough to remain part of the family fold. Yet the guest house, for all its independence, created an invisible boundary. It was a physical manifestation of proximity and distance, close enough to share a family connection, far enough to live life on his own terms. In hindsight, this separation would become crucial. And then there was the garage. A space most people think of as mundane, utilitarian, even boring. But in this estate, the garage would become the epicenter of a nightmare. A place where cars, tools, and boxes were meant to be stored safely, away from view, would instead hold the evidence of a tragedy that no one could anticipate. When investigators first arrived, the contrast between the normalcy of the garage's design and the horror within was almost surreal. It was, in every sense, an ordinary space transformed into a scene of extraordinary violence. Inside the estate, every detail mattered. Staff who had worked for the family for years noticed subtle changes in behavior leading up to the tragedy. Small anomalies, a door left unlocked, a tool out of place, an unusual silence, were minor in isolation but ominous in retrospect. The tension was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, a quiet shift in the rhythm of life within the walls of the property. The layout of the estate itself mirrored the dynamics of the family. The main house, commanding and elegant, reflected Rob and Michelle's presence in the world, their influence, their reputation, their need for control. The guest house, smaller and slightly removed, reflected Nick's position, part of the family, yet independent, navigating his own space and identity. And the garage, tucked away yet accessible, would become the stage where these worlds collided in a way no one anticipated. Walking through the rooms of the main house, one can imagine the daily routines. Morning coffee in the sunlit kitchen, family breakfasts, casual conversations by the fireplace. Evenings might include discussions about Rob's projects, Michelle's personal endeavors, or the comings and goings of neighbors. From the outside, life seemed calm, structured, and harmonious. But the reality of daily interactions often reveals complexities invisible to outsiders. Arguments, passive-aggressive exchanges, and subtle resentments can exist under the surface, never fully visible, yet shaping the emotional landscape of a household. And so, the stage was set. The estate was a character in itself, luxurious yet tense, familiar yet unpredictable. It held the daily lives of a family whose personal histories, ambitions, and conflicts intersected in ways that would soon spiral into tragedy. Every hallway, every door, every room was part of the narrative. Not just the main house, but the guest house and the garage, spaces that would play pivotal roles in what unfolded. Nick's presence in the guest house, for example, was far from incidental. It was a space where autonomy and proximity existed simultaneously. He was physically near his parents, yet his world was separate. That separation, however, did not equate to emotional distance. Family dynamics are rarely so neatly contained. Tensions, frustrations, and misunderstandings inevitably cross physical boundaries, sometimes with devastating consequences. The garage, in particular, was a space whose significance only became clear in retrospect. Initially, it was a functional area used for storage, maintenance, and routine tasks. But the combination of proximity, accessibility, and isolation made it the perfect, though horrifying, setting for what occurred. It's often in spaces like this, mundane yet private, that the ordinary can turn extraordinary, and the familiar can become terrifying. Consider the perspective of the first responders who entered the property. They were accustomed to high-stakes investigations, to discovering crime scenes in homes both modest and extravagant. Yet even for seasoned professionals, the contrast between the estate's appearance and the horror found within was stark. The garage, ordinary in structure, contained something that defied expectations. The juxtaposition of wealth, normalcy, and violence created a surreal, almost cinematic tableau. Every element of the estate tells a story of its own. The guest house reflects independence. The main house reflects authority and stability. The garage, ironically, becomes a mirror of chaos and vulnerability. This interplay of spaces mirrors the emotional dynamics of the family. Physical proximity does not guarantee emotional closeness. Affluence does not prevent tragedy. And appearances, no matter how polished, cannot obscure the realities of human behavior. Even the smallest details in the estate would later prove significant. Security footage, movement patterns, and subtle environmental cues became crucial pieces of the puzzle for investigators. Each door, each window, each access point was scrutinized for insight into what happened. And what emerged was a story that went far beyond mere statistics or crime reporting. A story about trust, betrayal, and the fragility of human relationships, all unfolding in a space that from the outside appeared perfectly controlled. Neighbors described the estate as quiet, peaceful, and orderly. From their perspective, the Reiners lived a life few could aspire to, but everyone admired. Yet the contrast between their perception and the reality within those walls would become one of the most shocking elements of the story. Violence, it seemed, did not announce itself. It lurked, hidden in plain sight, ready to emerge where no one expected. The estate, in essence, was both a sanctuary and a stage. It protected the family from outside intrusions, while simultaneously providing the backdrop for a tragedy that would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. Understanding the estate is crucial to understanding the story itself. The spatial dynamics, the isolation, the proximity, and the privacy all contribute to the context in which the events unfolded. And then there was the garage. The space that seemed mundane, almost irrelevant, became central to a horror that would shock not only the neighborhood but the world. Cars and tools were meant to be stored there. Boxes, seasonal items, and mundane household clutter filled the shelves. And yet, on that fateful day, the garage became a site of discovery that would redefine the meaning of fear, grief, and tragedy. The ordinary had become extraordinary, and the extraordinary would leave scars far beyond the physical space. As investigators prepared to enter the garage, as neighbors speculated and the media swarmed, the estate itself stood silent, indifferent, and yet complicit in its own way. It held within its walls the story of a family, the dynamics of love and tension, and the site of a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. The contrast between appearance and reality, between public perception and private truth, would become a recurring theme as the investigation unfolded. By the end of this chapter, one thing is clear. The estate is more than a backdrop. It is a character, a silent witness, and a reflection of the family dynamics that would culminate in disaster. Every hallway, every room, every corner holds a story, and every story contributes to the narrative that is about to take a dark and irreversible turn. And yet, even as we understand the layout, the spaces, and the dynamics, the most shocking revelations are still ahead. Because what investigators would uncover inside the garage and the implications it carried would redefine everything we thought we knew about the Reiner family, their relationships, and the events that led to that fateful day. Sunday evening in Brentwood had the appearance of calm, ordinary suburban life. Streetlights flickered on as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Birds had gone quiet. The city was settling into its nightly rhythm. To an outsider, there was nothing remarkable about the Reiner estate, nothing to suggest the horror that was about to unfold within its walls. Yet, for the Reiner family, that evening would mark the irreversible collapse of a life carefully constructed over decades, a night that transformed familiarity into nightmare. It began, as so many tragedies do, with small, almost mundane moments. Rob and Michelle Reiner had spent the day in relative normalcy, attending to personal routines, perhaps discussing projects, or engaging in the small, private interactions that define family life. These interactions, seemingly trivial, carry weight in hindsight. A casual remark, a delayed response, or an unspoken tension can all contribute to a chain of events that spirals beyond control. The final hours before the tragedy were marked by subtle anomalies. Sources later reported that Rob had retired to his private study in the main house to review scripts and notes. Michelle, known for her evening routines, may have been preparing dinner or simply enjoying a quiet moment in the living room. The son, Nick, remained in the guest house, isolated yet in close proximity to the family. It was an ordinary setup, the kind of domestic scene that provides no hint of impending disaster. But disaster rarely announces itself. The first signals of disruption were imperceptible, almost invisible. Perhaps a door left slightly ajar, a car door left unlocked, or a faint sound in the distance that went unnoticed. Investigators would later describe how these seemingly minor details could provide clues about the sequence of events that followed. In family tragedies, it is often these small deviations from routine that offer insight into the emotional and psychological state of those involved. The timeline of the night is critical. Between the hours of 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., the family was reportedly engaged in separate activities, each member occupied with their own tasks. To the casual observer, nothing seemed amiss. Yet within these hours, tensions that had simmered beneath the surface began to converge. Longtime family friends would later describe subtle signs of friction in interactions between Nick and his parents. Gestures, expressions, or tones that, at the time, seemed insignificant, but in retrospect, foreshadowed conflict. As the evening progressed, minor disagreements or unspoken frustrations can escalate, particularly in households with complex emotional histories. Conflict, once triggered, often moves faster than anticipated. What may begin as a small argument can quickly spiral into confrontation. And when that confrontation occurs within the enclosed, private spaces of a home, particularly one with access to objects that can be used as weapons, the potential for violence increases exponentially. It is also important to understand the psychological context. Nick, at 32, was navigating the complicated dynamics of a household in which he was both a son and a guest, both dependent and independent. Family expectations, coupled with personal ambitions and private frustrations, can create a volatile mix. Psychologists often note that familial proximity can intensify conflicts, particularly when combined with stress, isolation, or perceived grievances. In the Reiner household, these elements converged on that fateful night. Witnesses later described unusual activity in the hours preceding the tragedy. Security footage and neighbor observations suggested movement around the estate that was inconsistent with normal Sunday routines. Whether it was the opening and closing of doors, trips to and from the guest house, or moments of silence that seemed uncharacteristic, these deviations hint at the psychological state of those involved. Each movement, each sound, and each decision carried weight, contributing to a narrative that would only become clear after the events had fully unfolded. The emotional environment of the house that night cannot be understated. Families, even in peaceful circumstances, are not devoid of tension. But in the Reiner household, tensions that had been dormant or subtly expressed now reached a critical point. The interactions that followed were private, yet their consequences would become public, shocking a nation. It is the convergence of ordinary moments with extraordinary emotion that defines so many tragedies, and this was no exception. By late evening, the sequence of events reached a moment of critical escalation. Investigators pieced together evidence suggesting that confrontation had occurred between family members. The precise triggers remain partially obscured by conflicting reports, but what is clear is that the night's events rapidly transitioned from domestic disagreement to deadly violence. The speed at which the situation deteriorated underscores the volatility inherent in complex family dynamics, particularly under the pressures of expectation, proximity, and historical tension. Details from forensic analysis indicate that multiple locations within the estate were involved, including the main house and the garage. While the main house remained a site of emotional and physical engagement, it was the garage, previously a mundane space, that became the epicenter of tragedy. Objects intended for ordinary use became instruments of death. The juxtaposition of daily life with lethal action is both shocking and deeply unsettling, emphasizing the thin line between normalcy and catastrophe. Neighbors later recounted hearing nothing unusual that evening. No shouting, no commotion, no alarms. This silence contributed to the surreal nature of the discovery the following morning. To them, the Reiners' estate was a picture of calm, order, and tranquility. And yet, behind closed doors, a violent and irreversible event was unfolding. The contrast between perception and reality is a recurring theme in tragedies like this, illustrating how appearances can deceive and how private actions can remain entirely hidden until consequences force them into the open. In the hours leading to the discovery, Nick's interactions, or lack thereof, became central to understanding the chain of events. Investigators would later reconstruct movements, communication patterns, and behavioral cues that highlighted a mixture of tension, isolation, and potential premeditation. The night was not marked by public outbursts but by private, rapid escalation, a sequence invisible to neighbors but tragically consequential. And then, as the night drew to a close, the culmination of these events reached its horrifying climax. The violence, which had built in private, had consumed the lives of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Their bodies, victims of a brutal attack, lay lifeless in a space that had been ordinary moments before. The normalcy of Sunday evening had been replaced by a scene of unimaginable horror, a tragedy that would shock Hollywood, the nation, and everyone who would later learn the details. It is important to pause here and reflect on the emotional resonance of the night. Tragedy often begins in silence, in small gestures, in unspoken tensions. And when it erupts, it leaves devastation that extends beyond the immediate victims, touching family, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who struggle to comprehend the events. For the Reiners, the night of the tragedy became the defining moment of irreversible change, a dark pivot from routine to catastrophe. Yet, even as the details of the night itself are reconstructed, the most shocking revelation had not yet occurred. The bodies of Rob and Michelle were still undiscovered by authorities, and the world had yet to confront the visual and emotional impact of what had transpired. The garage, a space that seemed ordinary and secure, held the key to understanding the magnitude of the horror. Its discovery would not only provide evidence, but also a shocking confirmation of the fears and suspicions that had begun to coalesce in the minds of investigators and family alike. So as the night ended, the Reiner estate remained silent, still, and seemingly untouched by the chaos that had occurred. Yet within that silence lay the evidence, the clues, and the stark reality of a tragedy that would soon erupt into public awareness. Every detail, from the location of objects to the state of rooms, would contribute to a narrative that combined human psychology, familial tension, and violent consequence in ways that few could have anticipated. And it is at this moment, the transition from private violence to public discovery, that the story takes its most shocking turn. What would be found the next morning in the garage and elsewhere in the estate would not just confirm the worst fears, but also ignite a sequence of events that would dominate headlines, captivate the public imagination, and leave questions about family, wealth, and morality that remain uncomfortable and unresolved. The morning of the discovery began quietly, deceptively so. Sunlight filtered through the trees surrounding the Brentwood estate, casting long shadows on the manicured lawns. Birds sang as if unaware of the horror that awaited. To the casual passerby, it was a serene Sunday morning, the kind of peaceful start to the day that encourages coffee on the porch and leisurely plans. But within the walls of the Reiner estate, the ordinary would collide with the unimaginable, and the world would soon be forced to confront the unthinkable. The first hints of disaster were subtle. A neighbor reported seeing the garage door slightly open. A minor anomaly, almost dismissible in a neighborhood where residents are accustomed to early risers and weekend activity. But the open door created a ripple of concern. Something felt off, something beyond ordinary Sunday routine. As curiosity and worry grew, someone made the call that would transform a quiet morning into a headline-dominating crisis. The authorities needed to investigate. By the time law enforcement arrived, a tension hung in the air, thick and foreboding. Officers approached the garage cautiously, aware that reports were vague but grave. The silence of the estate contrasted starkly with the alarm bells now ringing in their minds. Every detail, the landscaping, the driveway, the orientation of vehicles, suddenly became critical context. The ordinary shapes of a family estate suddenly seemed like clues in a puzzle that no one wanted to solve, but everyone needed to understand. As the garage door was lifted, a sight greeted them that no training or experience could fully prepare them for. The space that had once been mundane, a place for cars, tools, and storage boxes, was now a scene of incomprehensible violence. Rob and Michelle Reiner lay lifeless, victims of a brutal attack that defied understanding. The sheer shock of the discovery was compounded by the intimate familiarity of the location. This was not a remote crime scene. This was a family home, a place of comfort transformed into a theater of horror. The initial reactions of first responders were a mixture of professional detachment and human shock. Investigators, paramedics, and officers had encountered violent crime before, but the emotional weight of discovering a beloved family within the confines of their home created a surreal, almost cinematic tension. Notes were taken, photographs were captured, and every inch of the scene was meticulously documented. The garage, in all its ordinariness, had become the epicenter of tragedy. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by curiosity and fear. Whispers spread rapidly through the usually quiet Brentwood streets. "Did you hear? The Reiners, something happened." Social media lit up almost instantly with speculation, photos, and the first tentative reports. The world outside the estate began to catch up to the reality inside. The icons of Hollywood, a couple admired and seemingly untouchable, had fallen victim to violence in their own home. The scale of the tragedy became apparent quickly. Both Rob and Michelle bore signs of a violent struggle, injuries that were clearly inflicted in a sustained and deliberate manner. Forensic teams worked with precision, documenting positions, examining blood patterns, and looking for evidence that could illuminate the sequence of events. Even as they worked, the emotional gravity of the scene was impossible to ignore. The familiar, comforting space of the garage was now a site of death, disbelief, and unanswered questions. The initial shock of the discovery raised immediate questions. Who could commit such an act? How could it happen in a home that was supposed to be a sanctuary? And perhaps most disturbingly, why here, within a family that appeared to outsiders to be perfect? These questions would fuel the investigation, dominate media coverage, and haunt the community for weeks, months, and years to come. Attention quickly turned to Nick, the son. While investigators initially treated every possibility with caution, the proximity of a family member who lived on the property became impossible to ignore. Suspicion, once a subtle undercurrent, surged into the foreground of the investigation. Family dynamics, often complex and nuanced, became central to understanding not just what happened, but why. The son's presence in the guest house, a space designed for independence yet inseparable from the family, added layers of complexity to the case. First responders described the scene as surreal. The juxtaposition of wealth, normalcy, and violence created an almost cinematic tableau. Luxury vehicles sat idle, tools remained in their racks, and boxes lined the walls. Ordinary objects now framed by extraordinary tragedy. The contrast between what the space was intended for and what it had become intensified the horror. Investigators noted the stark irony. A space designed for mundane safety had become a stage for the ultimate violation. The reactions of the immediate family, extended relatives, and friends added another dimension. While they were not present at the estate, their shock was palpable. Calls, texts, and messages poured in from around the world. Colleagues, friends, and neighbors expressed disbelief and grief. The personal losses were compounded by public scrutiny, creating a pressure cooker of emotion, speculation, and media attention. Everyone was searching for answers, yet the answers were hidden within the confines of that ordinary garage, now transformed into a symbol of horror. The investigation began in earnest. Forensic experts documented every inch of the space, looking for signs of struggle, collecting fingerprints, and analyzing evidence that could reveal not only the who, but the how. The meticulous process underscored the gravity of the situation. Every detail mattered, every trace of action could hold significance, and every discovery would have implications for the unfolding narrative. And yet, even amidst the professional detachment, the human impact could not be denied. First responders, investigators, and neighbors alike spoke of an emotional weight that lingered long after the initial discovery. The bodies themselves, familiar yet now unrecognizable in death, created a tension that would shape not just the investigation but the public perception of the tragedy. The estate, once a symbol of security, had become a place of fear, grief, and disbelief. The discovery of the bodies also marked a shift in the story from private tragedy to public spectacle. Media coverage was immediate and relentless. Headlines splashed across news outlets. Hollywood icons found dead in Brentwood estate, son arrested after parents stabbed, and tragedy behind closed gates. Social media amplified the story, blending fact, speculation, and conjecture in a way that would shape public perception long before the details of the investigation were complete. The emotional resonance of the discovery cannot be overstated. Families, friends, colleagues, and the public were confronted with a brutal reality. Violence had infiltrated a household that had appeared safe, controlled, and untouchable. The juxtaposition of expectation and reality created a sense of disbelief and horror that would reverberate for weeks. It was a stark reminder that even those who seem secure, even those who seem beyond reach, are vulnerable to tragedy. As investigators continued to process the scene, the story began to unfold layer by layer. Evidence collected from the garage, the guest house, and surrounding areas would soon provide insight into not only what had happened but why. The initial discovery was just the beginning, a shocking revelation that opened the door to a far more complex narrative involving family dynamics, hidden tensions, and the psychology of tragedy. Yet, even with bodies discovered, forensic evidence collected, and suspicion forming, one critical truth remained unclear: the sequence of events that led to the tragedy. How did what seemed like an ordinary Sunday evening culminate in this horror? Who was involved, and what were the motivations behind such a violent act? The answers were not immediately apparent, and it would take days, weeks, and months of meticulous investigation to piece together the story. For now, the world could only grapple with the initial shock. The garage, the guest house, and the estate itself had transformed from symbols of luxury and comfort into the epicenter of a tragedy that would dominate headlines and provoke profound questions about family, trust, and the fragility of life. The discovery of the bodies marked a turning point, a moment when ordinary life collided with extraordinary violence, and the narrative began to shift from speculation to investigation, from fear to search for truth. And just when it seemed the horror had reached its peak, investigators uncovered initial evidence pointing to someone close to home, someone whose presence had been routine, ordinary, yet now cast in an entirely different light. The discovery of the bodies was only the beginning. What would come next, the evidence, the interrogation, the mounting suspicion, would unravel the story in ways no one anticipated. The moment the authorities arrived at the Reiner estate, the ordinary Sunday morning was transformed into a meticulously orchestrated crime scene. Law enforcement had seen horrific incidents before, but nothing quite prepared them for the stark contrast between the estate's serene appearance and the gruesome reality inside. Every inch of the property, from the main house to the guest house and the now infamous garage, became a potential repository of clues, each one critical to understanding not just what happened, but why. From the outset, the approach had to be methodical. Officers secured the perimeter, cordoning off the estate to prevent contamination of the scene. Media crews were held back, neighbors questioned, and every movement documented. Inside, forensic teams moved with painstaking precision. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing the scene from every angle. Gloves, evidence bags, and tools were employed with surgical care. Every drop of blood, every fingerprint, every misplaced object could hold significance. In a case like this, minutiae mattered as much as the obvious signs of violence. The garage, where Rob and Michelle had been discovered, became the epicenter of investigative focus. Investigators noted not only the positions of the bodies, but also the surrounding environment. The placement of tools, the orientation of personal items, and the faint traces of a struggle. The juxtaposition of normal household items with acts of extreme violence heightened the surreal quality of the scene. It was as though a carefully constructed world had been shattered in the most intimate of spaces. Interviews began almost immediately. Neighbors were questioned about unusual activity leading up to the tragedy. Staff and household employees were asked for their observations. Friends and acquaintances were contacted to reconstruct the family's recent interactions and emotional state. Every narrative had to be cross-referenced, every statement verified, because even the smallest discrepancy could illuminate the path to understanding. Investigators knew that while evidence is vital, human testimony often provides the framework for interpretation. The initial focus, naturally, was on establishing a timeline. Detectives wanted to know when Rob and Michelle were last seen alive, when Nick had been observed in the guest house, and any other movements that could explain the progression of events. Security footage was scrutinized frame by frame. Motion sensors, cameras, and digital logs were examined for anomalies. In a high-profile case like this, the blend of technology and human observation becomes essential. It provides both clarity and context, anchoring the chaotic narrative in tangible facts. During these early hours, investigators also began considering potential motives. While it may seem almost impossible to speculate about why such violence could erupt in a wealthy, high-profile family, experience shows that wealth, proximity, and family dynamics often intersect with tragic consequences. Patterns from prior cases, disputes over inheritance, familial resentment, mental health struggles, and long-simmering conflicts were all considered as part of the investigative process. No potential avenue could be ignored, no assumption left untested. The guest house, home to Nick, was of particular interest. Investigators carefully examined the residence for signs of entry, exit, or evidence of conflict. They searched for digital traces, cell phone records, computer activity, and communication logs that could shed light on his movements and intentions. Each discovery, however small, was a potential piece of a puzzle that remained frustratingly incomplete. The proximity of the son to the victims, combined with the intensity of the crime, created a scenario that demanded both caution and urgency. At the same time, investigators were tasked with managing public perception. The Reiner family, household names with decades of fame, were now subjects of intense media scrutiny. Every statement, every press release, every police update had to balance transparency with procedural caution. The goal was not just to gather evidence, but also to maintain the integrity of the investigation in the face of relentless public attention. Missteps could compromise the case, and in high-profile instances, the pressure is magnified exponentially. The investigation unfolded in layers. Forensic teams meticulously collected evidence from the garage, fingerprints on tools, fibers on surfaces, and traces of blood patterns that suggested the dynamics of the struggle. Blood spatter analysis provided insights into the sequence of attacks, the positions of the victims, and the force used. Investigators noted the care, or lack thereof, in how the attack had been executed, considering whether the violence was impulsive, calculated, or a mix of both. Each analysis brought them closer to reconstructing the night's events. As the hours passed, patterns began to emerge. The combination of physical evidence, digital traces, and human testimony pointed investigators toward one individual, Nick Reiner. The evidence was circumstantial at first: proximity, opportunity, and subtle behavioral indicators. But as the team pieced together details from multiple sources, the picture became clearer. Nick's interactions, movements, and choices on that night created a narrative consistent with the crime. Yet, despite mounting evidence, law enforcement proceeded cautiously, understanding that high-profile cases require an unassailable chain of evidence before moving toward arrest. During the investigation, law enforcement also considered the psychological profile. Experts assessed the dynamics of family relationships, behavioral patterns, and potential stressors. Nick's position within the household, both physically isolated in the guest house and emotionally intertwined with the family, became a central point of analysis. Profilers looked at possible triggers, prior conflicts, and the psychological impact of living under scrutiny and expectation. While psychological profiles cannot prove guilt, they provide essential context for understanding motive and behavior. The investigation also had to consider media influence. In high-profile crimes, the public narrative can shape perceptions even before formal conclusions are reached. Every rumor, every social media post, every speculation piece had the potential to influence witnesses, informants, or even the suspect. Police worked to control information, provide factual updates, and ensure that investigative integrity was maintained amidst a cacophony of public attention. By the end of the first day, law enforcement had established a preliminary understanding of the events. The crime scene had been documented, forensic evidence collected, digital traces analyzed, and the initial pool of witnesses interviewed. While much remained to be determined, a pattern had emerged pointing toward Nick as the primary suspect. His proximity, access, and behavioral indicators created a narrative that investigators could no longer ignore. Yet, even with this growing clarity, questions remained. How could a family tragedy escalate to such violence? What had been the tipping point? And how would Nick respond when confronted with the evidence? The answers were still obscured by the layers of the human psyche, by the secrecy of family interactions, and by the complexity of relationships that few outsiders could understand. And then came the critical next step, the confrontation. With evidence mounting, investigators prepared to make their move. The arrest of Nick Reiner would not only provide answers, but also create new questions. It would shift the story from speculation to confirmed reality and set the stage for a legal, emotional, and public drama that would dominate headlines and captivate the nation. The moment Nick Reiner was confronted by law enforcement, the quiet facade of the Brentwood estate shattered completely. Hours of painstaking investigation had led to this point. The identification of a suspect whose proximity, opportunity, and behavioral indicators could no longer be ignored. The arrest was both inevitable and shocking. Inevitable because evidence pointed directly to him. Shocking because it involved a son turning against the very parents whose lives he had been entwined with from birth. It was early evening when police approached the guest house. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting elongated shadows across the manicured lawn. The estate, which had seemed serene and secure just hours earlier, now felt like a stage set for tragedy. Officers moved with precision, aware of the delicate balance between maintaining control, ensuring safety, and preserving the integrity of the arrest. Every step had to be calculated, every word measured. Nick was reportedly calm at first, a demeanor that investigators later described as both unnerving and perplexing. In situations of extreme stress, responses vary widely, from panic and aggression to detachment and composure. Nick's initial calm suggested a level of emotional regulation that could either be interpreted as composure or, chillingly, a detachment from the gravity of the events. This psychological complexity would become a central focus in understanding both motive and intent. As he was escorted from the guest house, the scene drew attention from neighbors and media outlets, though barriers and police protocol kept the public at a safe distance. Officers ensured that the arrest was conducted without escalation, but the symbolic weight of the moment was palpable. A son, once presumed safe and loyal, now a suspect in the violent deaths of his parents. The arrest itself marked a turning point, shifting the narrative from tragedy discovered to crime under scrutiny and suspicion confirmed. During the initial processing, investigators adhered to strict protocol. Nick was read his rights, his personal belongings secured, and preliminary questions documented. At every stage, officers were aware of the high-profile nature of the case, the potential for media sensationalism, public speculation, and influence on potential witnesses. Procedures had to be meticulous, not only to protect the investigation, but to ensure that the case would stand up to legal scrutiny in the courts. The reactions from those connected to the family were immediate and visceral. Extended relatives, friends, and colleagues expressed a mixture of disbelief, horror, and grief. How could a son, living in proximity to his parents, be implicated in such a violent act? The juxtaposition of familial expectation and violent reality created a narrative that was difficult to reconcile, emotionally and cognitively. Friends of the family described the arrest as a shock so profound it was almost impossible to articulate. Within the precinct, investigators began the process of questioning. Initial interrogations focused on establishing facts, timelines, interactions, and the presence or absence of potential witnesses. Nick's responses were scrutinized for consistency, contradictions, and emotional cues. The goal was not only to gather evidence, but also to understand the psychological and emotional context in which the events occurred. Every word, pause, and gesture was analyzed with the precision of a high-stakes chess match. Parallel to the questioning, forensic teams continued to comb through the estate for additional evidence. The guest house, though smaller than the main house, yielded crucial insights. Digital devices, personal items, and physical spaces were examined for clues about interactions, planning, and intent. Investigators worked to reconstruct Nick's movements in the hours leading up to and following the crime, cross-referencing statements with physical evidence and digital footprints.